We thought the problem was strangers using our driveway. We were wrong. The real problem lived next door. When we bought the house, the driveway was constantly being used by people who had nothing to do with us. Cars would pull in to turn around, work trucks would park there during the day, and sometimes we'd wake up and find complete strangers sitting right in front of our property. It was annoying, but it seemed like a simple problem to solve. So we made a few calls. We checked with the township, we checked with the Department of Transportation, we even spoke to the neighbor. Nobody objected. In fact, the neighbor told us, do whatever you think is necessary. So, we did. The barrier had been there less than a week. At first, nothing happened. No complaints, no angry phone calls, no one came to our door, which almost made us think we had worried for nothing. Then, the cameras started recording. The first clip didn't seem important. A vehicle belonging to the neighbor's family came down the easement faster than usual. Not reckless, not enough to call the police, just noticeably faster. Then, it happened again. And again. A few days later, another vehicle flew past while the homeowners were standing out. The speeding only started after the barrier appeared. The same barrier everyone had already approved. The same barrier the township approved. The same barrier the Department of Transportation approved. And the same barrier the neighbor had personally told them to build. At first, they tried to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe people were having a bad day. Maybe they were imagining it. Then, a tree fell. Not on their property. The homeowners weren't looking for a fight. They weren't trying to take away anybody's access. They weren't blocking the easement. They weren't changing the legal rights attached to the property. They had simply tried to stop strangers from treating their driveway like a public parking lot. But the people next door seemed to see it very differently. And the cameras kept recording. One clip after another, one incident after another, until a simple driveway project started looking a lot more like retaliation. A quick note before we continue. Suburban Verdict is a long-form, audio-first storytelling channel exploring the conflicts, mysteries, and unusual situations that unfold across suburban USA. Some stories are real court cases. Others are entirely fictional stories built around real laws, real documents, and real legal procedures. Every outcome could happen. If that's your kind of storytelling, subscribe. The first video was easy to dismiss. A vehicle came down the driveway a little faster than usual. Not enough to call the police, not enough to prove anything. Just enough to make us look at each other and ask, "Did you see that?" At the time, we told ourselves it was probably nothing. People have bad days. People get distracted. People drive too fast sometimes. But then, it happened again. And then, again. Every new recording looked slightly different. A silver sedan on Tuesday, a black pickup truck on Thursday. Different day, different driver, different vehicle. But the timing never changed. None of it had happened before the barrier. None of it happened while strangers were using the driveway. It only started after we cleaned the area up. The more footage we reviewed, the less it felt like coincidence. We weren't looking at a single incident anymore. We were looking at a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. Then, something else happened. A tree came down near the property. Not our tree, not our responsibility, not connected to the driveway dispute. And yet, sections of it somehow ended up done. But by that point, we were starting to notice something uncomfortable. Every time we tried to improve our property, every time we tried to solve a problem, something new seemed to appear. A faster vehicle, a different attitude, another small incident. By themselves, none of those things proved anything. Together, they started telling a story. And for the first time, we began asking a question that had nothing to do with traffic, landscaping, or... The confrontation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it answered a question the homeowners had been asking for weeks. The speeding wasn't accidental. The neighbor admitted she was angry about the barrier. For weeks, the homeowners had reviewed footage trying to figure out whether they were imagining things. Maybe the vehicles were moving faster. Maybe they weren't. Maybe the timing was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Now, for the first time, they had their answer. The neighbor was upset, and according to the homeowners, she admitted it. The strange part was why. The barrier hadn't blocked the driveway. It hadn't touched the easement. It hadn't taken away anybody's legal access. The project existed entirely on the homeowner's side of the property line. Yet somehow, it had become the center of the dispute. The confrontation happened while fence work was underway. The homeowners were outside discussing placement and measurements when one of the neighbor's adult daughters came down the driveway. Fast. Then, faster. As she passed, she shouted obscenities toward the property. By that point, the reaction felt impossible to separate from everything that had happened before. The recordings, the hostility, the change. A short time later, the neighbor approached. What followed wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was something much more revealing. The conversation kept returning to the same subjects: the barrier, the fence, the property line. Who could use what? Who could build what? And who got to decide? Then, the tension started to break. The volume dropped. The argument slowed. And the neighbor began speaking more openly. The answer was becoming impossible to ignore. The speeding was real. The hostility was real. And according to the homeowners, even the neighbor had finally admitted she was angry about the barriers. The fence project continued. The cameras stayed up. The lawyer's letter moved forward. And for the first time since the dispute began, the uncertainty started disappearing. The recordings existed. The incidents existed. The confrontation had happened, and nobody was pretending otherwise anymore. The dispute wasn't completely over. Nobody knew what would happen next. The fence was still being built. The cameras were still recording. And the lawyer's letter was still on its way. But after weeks of confusion, arguments, speeding, and footage, one thing had finally become clear. The problem had never been the strangers using the driveway. That was just the distraction. The real conflict started the moment the homeowners decided to take control of their own property. And the real problem had been living next door all along.